Which wrestler had a pet raccoon he would bring to the ring? I don't remember who.
Oh God! Whiskers? There was Whiskers Savage, but because there were so many.
They had pigs, I know. Yeah.
Well, the hillbilly guys at various points, I've seen pictures. Whether sometimes they did the possum. There's pictures with possums. Sometimes it was pigs. A lot of times the small pig, not the giant 600-pound pig. But along that, Whiskers Savage did something of that nature, maybe even more than one animal in his days in Texas. Did he not?
I was going to say Farmer Marlin, but I don't think that would be right. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Well, it wasn't Farmer Burns.
No, it certainly was not Farmer Burns. Yes.
No. He was a serious farmer. He wasn't any farmer to jack around with, was Farmer Burns.
You know what? I can admit that I didn't know until recently, and I feel a little embarrassed, but I never saw footage of these guys, and I only know the name from hearing about them. I never realized there were two different sets of Scufflin Hillbillies.
What?
I just never thought about it long enough, and then recently I was going through my Scufflin Hillbillies file, and it's like, these are two different teams.
Wait a minute, and there's a phrase that has not been used by anyone on this planet. In the last 20 years, I was going through my Scufflin Hillbillies file. Continue, please.
Well, that's really it. I was going through different files, and I saw Scufflin Hillbillies, and all I was thinking was, I've always heard how Vince McMahon loved the Scufflin Hillbillies. I've never seen any footage of them. Let me look at these pictures. And I start pulling out pictures. There's a different team in the 60s and a different team in the 70s, and I just never, ever realized it. I never had thought too much about it. I'd never thought about it at all, actually. And then I looked and I saw it and I was like, wow, I never realized two different teams.
I have met and talked to one of the original Scufflin Hillbillies because they were from, at least he was, Chuck Conley was from Ashland, Kentucky. But the original Scufflin Hillbillies were Rip Collins and Chuck Conley, right?
Yeah.
And that was the team that sold out Madison Square Garden and was big in the Northeast. That was the first hillbilly team. That was why they got over and why Vince remembered it and et cetera, because they did big business. In New York, they thought, they did the stereotype hillbilly from the 1920s, but, New York wasn't up on Appalachian culture at that point. And, oh, God, who was their manager? Was the first run, was it Cousin Alfred? I can't remember, but at any rate, and of course Vince Jr. redid the whole thing with a bigger budget and more people in the 80s with Hillbilly Jim and Cousin Jr. and Uncle Elmer.
And then Cousin Luke when Cousin Jr. left.
Cousin Luke when they lost Cousin Jr. Well, they always, they have big families down there in the hills. But anyway, Rip Collins and Chuck Conley were the originals, and Chuck actually used to come to the Crockett matches in Huntington, West Virginia, which is right across the river from Ashland in the 80s. And we got it. They were big. They were never, how to say this charitably. I mean, it's not like I saw their matches every night, but it wasn't like they were a revolutionary team in the ring like the Graham brothers or whatever the case. But they were two guys that happened to fit the bill and got the gimmick, and they got a big push up there. And then for the next, several years off of that, because they could say, they had been to Madison Square Garden and drew these big houses in the Northeast, because they didn't just work New York, they worked the whole Northeast. And they had a name in the business at that time, and they worked other smaller territories for several years off of that. But I don't think anybody ever said that they were Bockwinkel and Stevens, but it was they had a nice run, and Chuck was a nice guy. And then later on in the 70s, was it Chuck that got another partner? Did they redo the whole team to be? You've got the files now. Take over now with your knowledge, Mr. Wrestling News Archive owner.
Well, I don't have the files in front of me. They are downstairs in the files.
Well, you should have had it memorized.
Well, I didn't have it memorized, so I think it was a completely different tag team. I'm looking it up right now to see what I could find. I did want to ask you a brief question while I'm looking for this, though. You brought up that he would sometimes go to the shows when you work for Crockett. Obviously, there are guys who work for the office or were involved with an office for a long period of time who may show up frequently. You know, at Madison Square Garden, you hear about like Chris Candido's grandfather, Chuck Richards, would show up at the shows all the time. Like there are those kind of guys. But, and let's say the 80s, would you ever get, I mean, were there guys who would just show up like a one-off, like, oh my God, I can't believe this person is here, and then you never see them again? Were there guys from the past, like from 20 or 30 years earlier, who would just show up, they wanted to be around for a night?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, like, you know, when we went out to Amarillo in 86, late 86, early 87, because Dennis Condrey was still with us. We were there, you know, for the show for Crockett, and Don Fargo walked in. What the Don Fargo of all people we obviously, Dennis and Bobby had worked with him in the past. I had not seen him or talked to him since I got in the business, but as a photographer, he had a knowledge of who I was, right? But who would have thought Don Fargo would walk in Amarillo? And that's where I've told you the story before. He was living with a motorcycle gang there. And he'd sit on the fucking porch and drink beer and watch. They were so taken with him being a famous wrestler that they would wrestle for him. And he said, yeah, these some bitches are taking body slams on the gravel driveway. It's fucking great. I'm sitting back and watch. They're not smart. You know, and you know, we took some pictures with him. I still have to this day. But Mike Boyette one time happened to be living in San Antonio and came by. We were at the Hemisphere, and goddamn, I got such a huge kick out of him. And I managed him as Apocalypse, the Soldier of Fortune in Memphis early in my career. I was just talking to Bobby Fulton a couple weeks ago about that, where he's the only guy I've ever seen, Mike Boyette, when he was Apocalypse, that won a match and caused a career-ending injury from the match-winning move. He was going to do his diving headbutt off the second rope, because off top rope was illegal in those days. Off second rope, doing the diving headbutt to poor Bobby Fulton, who was just underneath babyface at the time. And he was working barefoot. He was working in combat boots originally, but they're like, fuck. You know, and he came in one day and he started to like fucking getting dressed, and he was barefoot. I said, what happened? He looked at me, he said, they told me to take my boots off. They said they were made out of potatoes. So he starts wrestling barefoot. So he's up on the fucking ropes barefoot, and his left foot slips as he goes to jump, and he went sideways and speared Bobby Fulton's midsection with the side of his head and jammed his neck and fucked his neck up. And it knocked the breath out of Bobby. So that he fucking lamely covers Bobby, and Bobby can't kick out anyway because he got no fucking breath, right? He got speared off the second rope head first in the gut. 1, 2, 3, and they're both laying there selling. And I've only been in the business 6 months, so I fucking roll in the ring, and Mike has just now turned over on his knees, and I grab his arm and fucking yank his arm up in the air. Yeah, he's the winner, and it was the fucking side he'd hurt his neck on. He was, oh, goddamn. And he pulls it back down. He's holding his arm. He's selling. Bobby is turned over, face down on the mat, can't get fucking up. I'm the only one that's still fucking mobile. And ended up, he hurt his fucking, I don't think he ever worked again. If he did, it wasn't.
Yes, he did.
Did he?
Remember, he had a losing streak in the UWF.
That's right. He came back, what was that, in 87?
86, 87, yeah.
Okay, well, this was 82 when that happened in Memphis. And as a matter of fact, son of a gun, when we were at the Hemisphere, maybe it didn't work, and I'm going to get a moral to this story here in a second, but he showed up in San Antonio. It was a Crockett show, and a bunch of the boys, you know, enjoyed seeing him and talking to him. But, you know, Mike Boyette was a guy that could hang almost with Chris Colt as far as being and they were partners at one time, although not long, obviously, as far as just being out there mentally. But he showed up in San Antonio. It looked like he had been literally digging holes for a living. He was covered in mud from head to toe and boots and work shit. And, you know, and I don't know whether he was trying to get booked or what, but shortly after that was where he did the thing in the UWF. But to answer your question, yes, you would see guys in general. I'll answer your question. You would see guys show up at shows every once in a while usually if they lived in the area and they either knew some of the guys that were on the card, even though they were currently retired or whatever, or out of the business. They knew some of the guys that worked with them, or every once in a while the promoter or the booker might invite him down, because I met Sam Mineker. The only time I ever met Sam Mineker when I was actually in the business, he was living in El Paso, and when we were in world class, they ran, what's the Army base out there? Fort Bliss. Fort Bliss is an Army base that, if that's the one that's near El Paso, we had an afternoon show there, and Sam Mineker walks in, the first wrestling announcer I ever saw. And so I marked out a little bit and shook hands with him, told him I, started watching the program when he was in Indianapolis and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it was guys that, that would have some connection and would come every once in a while. But, if they were guys in that position, they wouldn't come every week. You wouldn't, if somebody was coming every week, it either meant they wanted a job or they need to be buying a ticket, right? And that's what I was told early on. Dennis Condrey, as a matter of fact, is one that taught me this, probably. If it wasn't Frank Morrell, you never went to a show. When you're active in the business, never go to a show if you're not booked, unless you're so big they'd love to have you and they can't afford you. Because then it looks like you're looking for a job. And especially if you are looking for a job, they'll know that they can pay you less because you're looking for a job. Now they always tell the guys the exact opposite. Just show up and be seen. But in those days, in the territory days, when obviously they weren't just going to hire anybody because, we're short somebody, bring in the understudy. No, everybody was a wrestler, wanted a job in a territory. So it eventually shook out that, the guys, the last resort was Kansas City. If you couldn't get booked regular there, you might just think about going home and doing jobs locally. So in those days, you didn't show up if you were active in the business unless you were invited by the office or the booker, or you knew somebody figured in and, you were trying to make some specific arrangement. You didn't just wander in. It looked needy.
I have an update on the Scufflin Hillbillies.
Okay.
The originals were Rip Collins and Chuck Connolly.
Yes.
The second version, and this is interesting, I didn't realize this. The manager was Cousin Alfred.
Okay.
Cousin Slim, who was Marvin Cheatham. And Cousin Willie, who was Billy Garrett.
They didn't last long.
Well, Billy Garrett was one of the interns, wasn't he?
He was for a little while.
Yeah.
But they didn't last long as the Scufflin Hillbillies, because there was another set of Scufflin Hillbillies that worked for Phil Golden's All-Star Wrestling, and I don't have my files in front of me, but I think Chuck was part of that team with another partner, and they had a manager who was a cousin. So there were probably at least two sets, but the big set of Scufflin Hillbillies was Rip and Chuck by Cracky.
Well, Jim, if I was the type to get a Christmas gift for Vince McMahon, which I'm not, I may recommend a new plastic surgeon. I may recommend a nap. But perhaps I would get him a picture of a tag team he loved in his childhood, the Scufflin Hillbillies, perhaps many photos from my files, and I would send them right to a skylight frame.
That was a wonderful thought, Brian Last, and I will second that emotion, because if you want to give somebody in your social circle, family, or close COVID-free bubble, or even a billionaire wrestling promoter, a great gift for the holidays, our friends at Skylight Frames can hook you up. And folks, we've been talking about them on the program. It's not a frame for just one picture. It's a photo frame that you can have updated instantly by email from anywhere. People can email you multiple photos as long as you give them the information, and they can pop up instantly on the Skylight frame. You can zip through them. You can put them on the slideshow. You can thank people for sending them. You can tap the picture and just say, hey, thanks. Boom, all this stuff. And there's 100% satisfaction guarantee. If you don't love the Skylight frame, then they'll give you a full refund. You can load it up with your favorite pictures and then send it to someone, whether it be family or friends or pets or whatever. I don't mean you send it to a pet. You should put a picture of your pet on and send it to a member of your family. Do these things right. Anyway, you can bring pictures of yourself and your significant other, spouse, grandparent, whatever, all into this thing, and you can send them out willy-nilly. And we've already mentioned that I'm sure somebody is going to figure out in this pandemic age how to send pictures of themselves to a significant other that deserve to be framed in a frame as nice and stylish as this. Whether they're crying tears of joy or screaming in orgasmic pleasure, folks, they're going to love the Skylight frame. And right now, as a special offer, you can get 10% off your purchase of a Skylight frame when you go to skylightframe.com. That's SKYLIGHTFRAME.com, skylightframe.com. Everybody knows that. And enter the code DRIVE. $10 off a Skylight frame at skylightframe.com. Enter the code DRIVE. For heaven's sake, these are brilliant. And Brian, you've already done the whole thing for your family and your dad, and you've got one there, as I've mentioned, with the pictures of yourself at various moments of triumph in your life.
That's not true. But I have just bought another one recently. So now I have one for me, and I've purchased two as gifts for family.
Yes. And you've loaded them with pictures of yourself that slide back and forth in some scenes of your greatest triumphs, and you give them to your family members so that they can remember how great you are.
This sounds like something Jim Cornette would do.